Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Budget Monitoring Subcommittee. Item 1 is apologies for absence and Chairman's announcements. We have no apologies, everyone is all present and correct. And the only announcement I have at the moment is that our second guest, Andrew Gilligan, is running slightly late. Members will be aware that we did originally have an acceptance from a representative of London Councils who called out just before the meeting, so we've not been able to replace them. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Are there any additional declarations to those declared in the papers? No, thank you. Item 3 are the minutes of the previous meeting. Can we note the minutes from the 17th of October 2018 and can they be signed by me as a correct record?
Yep.
Thank you. Item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the report?
Yeah.
Item 5, the main item of business today is about road maintenance. I'd like to welcome our sole guest at the moment, Patrick Doig, who is the Divisional Finance Director at Transport for London. Patrick, welcome. We're going to talk to you a little bit about the decision to pause road maintenance that Transport for London have taken for the next 2 years. Can you give us an outline about why that's come about and the thinking behind it?
Yes. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure. I think, if I may, just briefly explain the difference between road maintenance, which we haven't actually paused, and road asset renewals, which is the element we have paused. We sometimes use those terms interchangeably, but as we're diving into things a bit deeper today, I think it will be helpful to explain the difference. I think the simplest way to understand the difference is on our carriageways. On a carriageway, maintenance would include things like fixing an individual pothole, attending a pothole and filling in that pothole with some blacktop, and that patch and mend repair would bring back that carriageway to acceptable condition. And that would last a couple of years before it needed further attention. Road asset renewal, on the other hand, would be treating an entire section of carriageway, taking off the entire top surface and replacing it with a new surface, so that section of carriageway was back to as new condition. And we do that every 10 to 15 years. So the distinction is important because it's that proactive asset renewal element that we've paused.
So this would be the difference between proactive and reactive road maintenance then?
That's often how we refer to it, yes.
But can I just ask you to pause for a second, Patrick, because just welcome to Andrew. Okay, you got held up on the way in, so we started slightly before you arrived, so you've not missed much. Patrick, back to you, sorry.
So the decision was taken due to the government's decision to remove our operating grant for Transport for London. That was the primary source of road maintenance and renewal for London as it was formed. And you can look back to when TfL was formed from its predecessor bodies. The grants that previously went to Highways Agency for its duties in London and Government Office for London, who previously funded the boroughs, was wrapped into TfL's transport grant. And therefore there was a logic for excluding London from other funding sources for highways because it had its own funding source through that grant. Now the situation has now clearly changed. That government grant has been removed, but the case remains that London is excluded from bidding from those other pots available for the rest of the country. As a consequence, we have to fund our asset maintenance and renewal from our own sources of income. That's primarily the surplus generated by the London Underground. So the pause of proactive asset renewals was not an easy decision to make, especially as we had, through some good asset management practices, been gradually improving the condition of our road network over the past 10 years and brought it to a really good standard. But however, those good asset management practices that we have established, really understanding our asset base, understanding how it reacts and forecasting how it will change, really helps us to adopt this reactive strategy in the knowledge that we can maintain a safe network and understand the implications of it. So it's not a decision we would like to have taken, but we have done given the funding arrangements that we're in.
Okay. You've never actually received a grant from government specifically for road asset maintenance, have you?
That is true. As I said, when TfL was formed, the grant of its predecessor bodies, some of which were specifically for road asset maintenance, were rolled into the...
20 years ago though, but the 700 million, which is what you're referring to, was not directed specifically at roads, was it? That was a TfL choice to spend the money on roads.
So it was given as a GLA transport grant. That's correct.
But TfL had discretion on where to spend it?
Within certain parameters, yes.
Mm-hmm. And you chose to spend it on road maintenance. But you could have spent it on other things, and you could spend some of your other money on other things as well, couldn't you? You have discretion over how you move your money around and what you spend it on.
Under some certain parameters, yes.
Yeah, okay. So it wouldn't be accurate then to say that it's a direct result of government grant for roads being withdrawn, which is what I've seen put around in some places. Not quite what you said, I grant you, but it is some of the messaging around this has been around that. It's directly linked to the two, and made it appear that government funding for roads has been cut, but that's not true.
But I think the point being the grant was our primary funding source for roads, and now without that, we lack a funding source that's suitable.
But that was a choice made by Transport for London, wasn't it?
But if you look at our other funding sources, effectively the transport the income we raise from passenger public transport fares, and a small amount of business rates that the Mayor retains and gives us to...
But equally, Transport for London chooses to put more than £700 million of subsidy into buses, doesn't it? It chooses to offer concessionary fares of over £300 million. There's more than £1 billion that Transport for London chooses to subsidise the public transport network. You could choose not to do that, couldn't you?
We could choose to do that. I think that brings us back to this kind of odd situation where we're trading off public transport and using public transport fare-paying passenger income to subsidise the roads. I don't think that's a flawed system to put us in.
That's a flawed argument as well, because you're using public subsidy to subsidise the public transport network. To say that the public transport network is subsidising roads is not accurate, is it? Because you are subsidising the transport network itself.
No, I think if you work through our funding sources and the sources and uses of that funding, we can show, and we are, using the surplus generated in the London Underground to fund road renewals, which is a
But you're
bit.
also using it to subsidise trips on the public transport network. The bus network is subsidised to the tune of over £700 million. I think it's £723 million this year. It's gone up from last year.
Yes.
That's a choice that you made, isn't it?
So that is a choice, and we're quite clear in our business plan that we've taken you through that our financial target is for buses and roads operating costs to be contained within 850 million. Mm-hmm. That's about the same amount that we get through business rates.
Oh yeah, but all I'm trying to establish here, Patrick, is that there are choices available to Transport for London, and these are the choices that you have made. It's not a no-choice scenario. It's not true to say government have cut funding to our roads maintenance because they didn't provide it for roads maintenance. They just gave you a grant. Mm. You chose where you were going to spend it. You're choosing to spend the money that you've got available on subsidising public transport. That's true, isn't it?
The thing that I slightly disagree on is that grant was a direct consequence of the roads funding that the government previously provided London, and that grant has been taken.
That was 20 years ago. We're talking about now. And Transport for London has chosen what its priorities are and where it's going to spend its money. That's the accurate situation, isn't it? It is inaccurate to say that you have no choice but to cut funding to roads. You do have choices. You have chosen to do what you're doing, and that's fine. But that is the truth, isn't it?
But the reason that we've been entered into that situation to make that choice has been the withdrawal of the funding.
Oh, yes,
if that
indeed,
funding was there,
but
we would not have made this choice.
No, of course you wouldn't. But the fact of the matter is that Transport for London does have options in terms of where it decides to put its money. And you have chosen to increase the subsidy on buses. You have chosen to maintain the concessionary fares. Equally, you have chosen to stop the proactive maintenance on the roads. That's a choice rather than something that's forced on you, because you could have chosen to do something else.
So there's an element of choice involved.
There is. Okay, that's good. Who ultimately makes the decision on whether or not to use capital and revenue underspends to fund road maintenance? Because you do have capital and revenue underspends this year, don't you? So we do, and as part of our business planning process and our annual budgeting process, we'll take stock of where we are in our current financial year and look forward in our projections for future years, and then make sure that we're allocating those resources appropriately. So that's part of the business planning and budgeting process overseen by the TfL board. So why is the decision not made to use the underspends on proactive road maintenance?
Because we looked at our priorities, and our first priority is maintaining safety, and actually the investments that we're making primarily across both our capital and revenue sphere in around safety. So that's what we've chosen to maintain the reactive renewals and maintain the investments that maintain safety. And that's a kind of a critical choice that we've made.
Today...
So can I just come in on that when you finish, just on the capital and revenue underspend?
Sure. Today, Transport for London's budget for 1920 was released just before this meeting. And in it, the 1819 forecast is a loss of £500,000, which is £222 million better than it was when the business plan was released, which is in December, so 3 months ago. Now, of course, that's still a loss. It's not profit, so we need to be careful with that. But the business plan is predicated over 5 years, and to much fanfare and triumphalism, it was announced that Transport for London will be in surplus by 22-23. Small surplus, 155 million, margin for error there. But that didn't assume that you would be £222 million closer to the mark by March than you were in December. What's happening to that £222 million?
We would look at that as part of our business planning process that we're entering this summer and publish towards the end of this year, about how our 5-year projection has followed through.
Yeah. So why couldn't that be spent on proactive road maintenance this year?
I think we'd have to look at the choices available to us as part of this business planning process, and also think about any other things that are changing, that have changed since we set that original business plan in terms of our other income streams or our other expenditure, and look at that in the round and make the right choice given the available funding that we have.
I appreciate these things are complex and there's lots of moving parts and there are decisions that have to be made. But when we received the business plan in December, I think we got it or we discussed it in January. It was defended very robustly by Simon Gilligan, by Mike Brown, as you would expect, and decisions were justified within it, and that's fine. One of those decisions was to pause proactive road maintenance for a 2-year period, and that was assumed on the numbers in the business plan. These numbers didn't assume that you would be £222 million better off 3 months later. So not spending that money on proactive road maintenance would be a choice, wouldn't it?
But I think we come back to the point you opened with, actually, that we need to achieve a break-even position and if not a small surplus to reinvest on our capital side. And although we are making a smaller loss and we're making good progress towards that break-even, we're still in a position where we are made £500 million loss this year, and our revised budget is improved from the business plan, but still has a net cost of transport operations of over 700 million. So I don't think there's a case that there's free money to be investing over that period, because clearly we need to get to break even before we have more flexibility to invest that surplus that's generated.
I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, and it's a fine point, but as I say, the robustness with which the business plan was defended to us suggests that TfL has a very high level of confidence, and indeed we did put that question directly in those terms to Simon Killenback and to Mike, and received assurances that they were very, very confident that it was robust and they were going to deliver those numbers. So that being so, given the potential, and we'll explore some of this in a moment, potential severity of downgrading the proactive road maintenance, you have some flexibility not to do that, don't you?
But we have to consider the other pieces of that financial upside that we have. And if you look at the kind of economic outlook, which is the key financial risk to TfL, given that influences the majority of our income through passenger fares, I think we'll have to take a view on the level of cash reserves that we need to take in a very economically uncertain environment. So I don't think
things on that, because I accept that point. But we were reassured that those factors had been taken into account in preparing the business plan, because we pushed hard on the business plan to look. There's a lot of things that can and will happen between now and 22-23, and we were assured that this had all been taken into account and those factors had fed in terms of coming up with a surplus of £155 million in that year. Now these things could change, and what you're arguing for is prudence, I accept that. But nevertheless, TfL does have the scope to do something about pausing or revising the pause in the proactive road maintenance programme, don't you?
And certainly the business plan's always been to stop that pause at the end of 2020 and restart proactive road maintenance from 2021. So we're in that relatively short period as we're already starting to remobilise our plans and bring that pipeline forward to do that proactive work next financial year. So I think there'll be a limited amount that we could accelerate the process of that, because actually we need to restart the process of bringing forward those designs and mobilising our supply chain. But there could be a potential to do some of it earlier, but we'll have to look at all the options available to us and our financial position at that moment in time.
The longer you allow an asset to decline, the more expensive it costs to correct it, isn't that right?
That is true. I think, as I said in my opening answer, actually we have built up a really good understanding of our assets. And we are doing this pause in a controlled and managed way. And actually we believe a 2-year pause has a relatively minimal impact on the long-term cost of those assets. We think it could be in the order of 1%. And in fact, so if we start restart our proactive road renewals as planned after the 2-year pause, we think the cost will be minimal. Clearly, if that pause is maintained for longer, you're absolutely right, that additional cost builds up exponentially over time.
Okay. So if the organisation doesn't do as well as the business plan forecast, do you think this pause could stretch into a 3rd year or even a 4th?
Well, certainly it's a risk, and that's the point we'll be making. Without a steady and sustained guaranteed funding source for roads, the funding for roads is exposed to wider fluctuations in the economy, which drives other demands such as passenger fares and other sources of income. If you compare that to Highways England, which has a long-term funding source, not just for its capital, but for its maintenance and asset renewal, it gives it much more certainty to make sound long-term asset management decisions. That's not the position that TfL is in with our funding streams and the way we're funded. So that's why we think that we would like a different way of funding London's roads.
Okay. And the arguments about vehicle excise duty are well rehearsed, and I think there is unanimity in the Assembly that devolution of vehicle excise duty down to London would make a lot of sense, and I would agree with that. What would be the impact of the roads funding going off into the future if a fares freeze is maintained beyond the end of this mayoral term?
Well, as I said before, I think it's a flawed system that's relying on public transport fares to cross-subsidise roads. And I think we're showing the interdependency between them in your question, that if our fares policy will impact our ability to do roads. So I think actually you're acknowledging there is an interdependency between the two. I think that is a flawed system, and that's the fundamental argument they're trying to make. I don't think it's the right way to manage our roads. So our business plan, as you know, assumes a fares policy for the next mayoral term, but it will be the mayor's decision each year of the day to inform that. And our business plan assumes RPI +1 on fares. Clearly, if the mayor chooses a different fares policy, we'll have a different amount of available funding, and we'll have to reprioritise the business plan at that stage. But again, I think the question is highlighting the benefits of disaggregating those two funding streams, having a steady and sustained funding source of roads to allow us to take
I'm not too sure that I accept your assertion there, because as we discussed earlier on, if you substitute the word subsidy for loss, roads loses, according to your business plan, about £270 million a year. The buses, according to your business plan, lose £723 million in the forthcoming year. And the concessionary fares is another £30 million on top of that. So if you're going to disaggregate the funding, then you need to do it for all passenger streams, don't you?
Well, I think there's a different argument about our different public transport modes having an element of cross-subsidy between the two. Clearly,
they always have. I mean, the bike hire scheme does that as well, doesn't it?
Yes, and clearly there's some transport options such as Divisional that don't have an income source, and it's quite right to cross-subsidise from mainstream transport. That what I haven't understood is a sound economic or business argument for subsidising road asset renewals from our public transport side of the business. I think if you look at...
Yeah, and I don't accept that that's what's happening, because the level of subsidy going into public transport dwarfs anything that you're claiming is going into roads. So the argument that fare payers are subsidising motorists really doesn't stack up when you look at the numbers. It's a way you can present the argument, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true.
I think that's as I said, I think we've made some progress in showing the sources and uses of our funding and where our money comes in and where it goes. I think it is true that as you've talked about, our business rates are funding the subsidy buses and the operations and reactive maintenance on roads. But actually our proactive capital renewals are funded by the surplus generated from the underground.
But that's a choice made by Transport for London, isn't it? You have discretion to make that choice.
To a limited degree, yes.
Well, to a very large degree. It really is up to Transport for London and the Mayor where you assign the money that comes into the organisation, isn't it?
But I think when we talk about the money coming into the organisation, we're talking about a relatively small amount of business rates. Clearly, the main money that comes into the organisation is fare income, and that's linked to running the services that income is related to.
Assemblyman Deval wants to come in.
I just want to pick up on the issues, and I think we've established there are choices and there are choices, but in terms of the two areas that were raised earlier on, and I was slightly confused by your answers, because either I've misread the transport plan, the business plan, the revised one post Crossrail debacle. On the capital overspends, somewhere in that plan, I'm sure I've read that's covering the slippages of projects where TfL are overrunning. Is that correct? And then on the revenue underspends, I thought the hierarchy or the primacy objective of the TfL business plan is to reduce the deficit budget, and you're using that to prop up some of that work on the revenue side. Is that the case? Have I completely misunderstood where TfL's business plan has come from in those two areas of both those underspends?
No, I think that's a correct way to summarise it. You do need to break the two down. That our capital underspends in any 1 year is generally timing, and then therefore that would have to carry forward to match forward the later sequence of those projects. And in terms of the improved or reduced deficit we have on our operating account, that's helping us get to our ultimate goal of breaking even on our operating side.
Okay, so if we get that, the one area then we ought to focus on is whether the primacy objective of reducing the overall TfL budget deficit should be that, or should we switch that back onto the roads issue? I mean, there is a choice there, isn't it? I mean, whatever we can. I just want to follow up. There are choices to be made. I don't necessarily agree with the chair's view about who subsidises who, but in terms that if you wanted to change this, if I was in charge of TfL and I wanted to change this outcome, then I could look at that as one option. There are probably other options as well. Can we just, is that... So if I took a cavalier approach, like my word cavalier, and said I don't want to deal with the TfL budget deficit, I could raid that budget, the revenue underspends, and switch it to this if you want. Some people would say it's cavalier. I'm just using that as an illustrative approach.
So I don't think there's any choice but to address the budget deficit on our operating side. I think there's no sustainable option but to get to break even. That's why it's our primary financial goal to achieve that by 22-23. I think no organisation can continue to consume cash running its day-to-day operations for the long term. That's why that we set out a business plan that brings us to break even. I don't think there's any other choice but to do that. And that's what we set out and defended in our business plan, and we're confident we can get there.
Okay, I'm going to have a look at the impact on the road system of the decision, see if I've taken Assemblyman
Yes, good afternoon, Patrick. I suppose behind all this, for me, is the impact on Londoners, and, you know, as an Assembly member, when my constituents write to me about injuries experienced because of potholes, being moved out of their homes by floodings because TfL roads and the infrastructure together have failed them. And indeed we've had bridges fail with fatalities and so all that to me leads to the question, when you talked about two different ways of working, road maintenance, road asset renewal, some of the examples I've given you fall into both those groups. So for instance, would road asset renewal include structural maintenance and major repairs?
Yes. So the difference between maintenance is the day-to-day patch and mend, wear and tear, and a renewal be replacing a major component, be it of a carriageway or it could be on a bridge, strengthening some of the fundamental infrastructure by replacing it, bringing it back to its original strength and expected life.
So in terms of the impact on Londoners, they're equal in a way. You know, I think when you said it before, it was like we could reduce our involvement in one because it was less important. That's not what you meant to say, is it?
No, certainly not less important. I think the reason for the differential was the differing time frames that would have an effect. I think maintenance is safety critical. If you're not fixing a defect
have to do that.
Prompt very, very quickly, it creates an immediate safety issue and it creates an immediate degradation to that asset, quality and the service benefit for users. Renewals stores up a problem over a longer period of time, and certainly that's why we wouldn't want to be in this situation for a prolonged period, but we thought a 2-year pause was manageable.
Because then when we look at, TfL publishes this overall measure of the TfL road network, which includes everything, the state of good repairs. Now, if you look at that, I've got a figure in front of me saying over the last 4 years, that's going downwards. So it's not as if you're in a state where you've made this decision where it's balanced. You know that the situation is getting worse because the state of good repairs was in 2017 at 91%. The state of good repairs projected to 2020 is 87.5. So are you saying you've made a calculated assessment that in ignoring road asset renewable, you will be able to deal with the major structural issues that will arise?
So I think there's two questions there, because the figures you're talking about are for the state of good repair of our carriageways. That doesn't include the structures such as tunnels and bridges and other things.
Okay,
although
so
we do have a
that's
similar
just
metric
carriageways.
on those things.
Yeah.
In terms of carriageways, the numbers you quote are correct. So we have a target state of good repair range between 90 and 95% for carriageways and footways. That target was based on a combination of what gives us the right whole life cost. In terms of the balance between that maintenance and that renewal, what's the right balance to do that to minimise the whole life cost, and also give us the best, what we thought was a best service outcomes. So this decision will take us out of that range. It will take us marginally out of that range on carriageways. As you said, we'll go down to 87.5%, and on footways we go down to 89.9%. So very, very narrowly outside that range. And we do want to bring that back. But we do think between 85% and 90% is an acceptable condition for London's road network, but it's not our target. That's why we do want to increase the funding for roads over the medium to long term to bring it back into that target range. I think in structures and tunnels, it's not covered by those figures, but that is an area where we have made significant investment. If you think about Hammersmith Flyover and some of our other major structures over the past 10 years, we have been investing in renewing and prolonging the life of those assets. But we are in a position where some of those will need attention over the next few years, such as Rotherhithe Tunnel is one of the ones that will be coming to the next few years to continue to renew those assets.
And the Assembly did a major piece of work last year because of the state of flooding in the north, south, all over, and TfL was at the heart of that because of the road system. So are you saying that these figures that you're working with have included issues to do with flooding in terms of it's something that's unresolved and that's big capital investment required?
No, so we have an understanding of all our different asset components, so drainage will be one of them, and actually we believe that's been in pretty good condition, so there's not any particularly major urgent
You
capital.
believe that's good?
In terms of a state of good asset that will require a major capital renewal, it clearly is important we continue the day-to-day maintenance of that, which should include gully cleanings and other things that keeps that asset effective. But from a capital renewal side, we don't believe that that's in any particular urgent need of significant investment.
Okay, so can you tell us then, in terms of claims for damage to cars and vehicles, because if you're not doing the road asset renewals, then won't that be increasing? So what was it during 2018-19? Do you have that?
Also, I don't have the numbers for claims with me.
But it's a possibility that that will increase.
Well, I'm happy to give you those figures after the meeting. The numbers that we did look at were the proportion of collisions that are due to road surface, which would be a key metric if we're concerned that the road surface is deteriorating. That's actually a very small percentage of collisions across London. It's between 0.1% and 0.2%, so less than 1/5 of 1% of all collisions in London, and that's been relatively stable over the past 10 years. So at the moment we haven't seen any evidence that the number of collisions due to the road surface are increasing, but it's a very good question about claims. That is numbers that we collect, and we're happy to share them with the committee.
Can I just go over to...
Just on that before you move on, have you modelled it? Because if you're going to reduce the spend on the road and there is a deterioration it logically follows there might be more claims on that. Have you modelled an assumption around what increase in claims you might get?
I don't believe so, but as I said, I think this is the importance between road maintenance. So road maintenance is going out and fixing defects promptly. And
It's reactive, so yeah, but proactive road
but
maintenance.
so it's fixing those defects promptly that avoids claims, because they'll avoid those defects being in the roads. The longer term proactive renewals means that you have to do fewer pothole fixing because the asset's in better structural condition. So actually what this means is that in the short term, we have to spend more on inspecting, monitoring and testing our assets so we can spot and fix those issues quickly. But we don't believe that would give rise to any more claims because because it's a safety critical thing, and that's the heart of what we need to do.
So there are aspects of, within the overall road maintenance programme, you're saying inspections would continue. There would be no reduction in those sort of services.
Absolutely.
Street lights would still be fixed. Or because they could, are they under reactive or are they under reactive renewals?
So it's the same for all our road assets. But to answer your first question, absolutely, we have not reduced inspections, monitoring, testing. In fact, we are increasing it to help make sure there's no increase in safety risk. That's really important. That's why that's part of that maintenance side, not our asset renewal side. And in terms of street lighting or traffic signals, again, the asset maintenance and the renewal do work in tandem. So if you're not doing one over time, you're putting much pressure on the other, and vice versa. But actually, in the short term, it's the maintenance that keeps those assets in good working order. So for traffic signals, we have a target that they're available 99.1% of the time, which is a very high level given they're so important. We've exceeded that over the past 2 years, and we're forecasting to exceed that again this year. For street lighting, similarly, we have a target of 95%. We've been above that for the past 2 years, and we don't expect to drop below that, because that's why that maintenance is so important, because that's what keeps the assets in working order and fix any defects as they arise.
I've got a couple of questions for you, but let me just bring Andrew in and say, from the world that you live in or work in, do you get a sense that damage to cars and cyclists and what have you are related to the maintenance side of things, so that if a pothole appears, it's immediately fixed, or if the lighting is bad, the response is adequate for journeys?
I think perhaps the key fact about London roads in the last couple of years is there's been an 83% rise in the number of people killed and seriously injured on them over the last 2 years. Particularly sharp rise in the last year. When TfL suspended proactive road maintenance, it said it would ensure that safety was maintained, and safety is clearly not being maintained. And that's in part, I'm sure, a consequence of the reduction in maintenance on the roads. People are hitting potholes, coming off and hurting themselves, going under cars, in some cases being killed. Vital schemes to make the roads safer have been left in limbo, and I mean, we can go into all of that later, but broadly, yes, I think it's a significant contributor to the striking rise in deaths and serious injuries that we've seen in the last 2 years.
But so that really then challenges the answer that you gave me. But you said you didn't have the amount, because that would be like a significant amount of claims and damages against TfL.
Yes, I just comment on the KSI killed and seriously injured number that Andrew quoted. That's comparing unmoderated data, very raw data from the Met Police for this year, against data that from the previous year that has been calibrated and moderated and verified. That does not provide a like-for-like comparison, and I would certainly not like on the record that KSIs have increased by 83%. Do not believe that's factually true.
Published on your website, so you must feel them of some worth to publish them on your own website.
As I explained, we're not comparing like for like there. If you look at the number of fatalities, which is clearly verified, that actually the number of fatalities for vulnerable road users decreased in 2018 versus in 2017. And we're working with the Met Police, who collect all this data and verify it, to make sure we have the data for 2018. But we do not believe there's been any increase in the number of people
the number of overall fatalities has also increased, Patrick.
Yeah. Certainly, if you were to be looking at reporting, you would get a sense that our streets are not as safe as they could be, if I can just feed that back to you. But you're saying that you're going to produce us figures that will be looking at claims for damages, and if we could have them sort of like over a 4-year period so we can see the growth, so that we can then get a sense of possibility
we'll do
where
the
it's
issue thing,
going
Patrick,
to.
we'll write to you and we'll put a
Yeah,
request
we'll
in and
write to
can
you
write back to us.
about that.
I think in that we'll include our stats on the people that are killed and seriously injured on our roads,
Yeah,
to make sure there's no ambiguity about the numbers that we've got.
Just seek clarification on this. I mean, in terms of the stats and the stats that I was looking at, I was looking for evidence between the number of people killed were mostly collisions. They weren't to do with road surface. So is there any evidence? Do you collect separate stats of where? I presume it's the police would determine that if it was to do with the road surface, because I think that's quite an important point. I do think our roads are not safe for certain cyclists and certain issues, and the work done by Andrew previously in terms of trying to rectify that, and hopefully is continuing on within TfL. But in terms of that, do you collect any separate stats to say that there are deaths caused by road surfaces problems?
Yes, as I mentioned in my previous answer. So the Met Police will record their view of the root cause of any collisions, both those with slight injuries and those with more serious injuries or fatalities. And road surface is a contributing factor that they will record. That accounts for a very small proportion of collisions in London. As I said, between 0.1 and 0.2%. So it's a very small amount. We don't have any evidence that that proportion is increasing.
But Londoner at the top of a Clapham omnibus, hearing about this move by TfL, will be concerned. Do you accept that there will be a degree of concern about the level of road maintenance, whether that's asset renewal or just straightforward road maintenance? Did you factor that into your thinking?
I certainly do, and we accept that roads are incredibly important to Londoners and all members of the public. Yeah. And we talked a lot about TfL's road network, but as we know, that's only 5% of London's roads. Yeah. Actually, it's a London-wide issue that not just TfL, but all the boroughs are facing in terms of this lack of funding for London's roads, not just TfL's roads. And actually, some of the boroughs' roads are in worse condition than our road network, and they're the ones that most bus users do use, probably most cyclists use on a daily basis. So actually supporting the whole of London to improve the quality of London's roads is really important.
I take your point, and you're taking all the heat because London councils couldn't make it. But we do know that in terms of percentage. But what we would be arguing is TfL is the transport authority, so and accountable. And led by a mayor of London, so therefore Londoners' concerns should be directed to TfL and to the mayor.
Yes, and we are working with the boroughs to make the case for investment in London's roads. And
then briefly, so in all of this, can you just give me some examples of what kind of road asset renewal or road maintenance, which would have been done, is not going to be done now?
So one example that members may be aware of is on the Rotherhithe Tunnel. That actually the ventilation systems there need renewal and improvement. And we have not been able to do that in this financial year, and we're scheduled to do that in the next year. The implications of that is that to keep the tunnel safe, which is our first priority, we've had to place increased restrictions on the numbers of vehicles that use that tunnel. So restricting it to some of the larger lorries and commercial vehicles entering that tunnel to make sure it's safe for those that do use it. And the users of those vehicles have to take a longer route through London as a result.
So that's slowing down traffic, just increasing congestion, polluting the air. So the consequences are much wider, aren't they, when TfL takes a decision like that? There's a ripple effect across London.
So I think we've been clear this is not a decision that we would have wanted to take, and a decision that we've been forced to take given the withdrawal of the government funding, which was our funding source for these activities.
But we have to be mindful of the rippling effect. And then, can you let us have a list of, you've given us that great example, but there'll be other things that you might have been doing which you're not doing now. So
yes.
it'd be good to have that list.
Okay.
And then there's the whole thing, like when you stop something, you lose the skills, don't you? Because it's very skilled stuff. So how long does it take to start it up again? Or have you never been in this experience before, TfL?
Well, in terms of the skills, I think the critical skills are the asset engineers and the asset owners, and that's been retained within TfL, and we've kept those staff on board because actually we've needed their skills to continue to monitor, inspect and test our assets. So actually those people are still there, and they've just been doing some different things than they would have otherwise been doing. What we have done or have seen is some of our supply chain have demobilised and they've reduced their capacity due to the lower profile of this year and next year, and we've worked with them to do that in a low impact way. And that's why our business plan sets out that we're giving them notice that not this coming financial year, but the financial year after, we will be restarting our proactive asset renewals, and we're working with them to remobilise over the coming 12 months.
And lastly, Chair, just a few things about traffic signals and street lighting, which I mentioned before. Where do they sit? And are we at a level where the maintenance, the functionality of these are at a high, or are they going down?
Well, as I mentioned briefly already, actually, both those are above their availability targets. So traffic signals is 99.1, and I think it's about 99.3 at the moment. And that's comfortably within our target range. And for street lighting, our target is 95% availability, and it's been above that in the last 2 years. Don't yet have the data that for the current financial year, but again, we expect it to exceed our target. As I mentioned, it's that day-to-day maintenance that would have the big impact if we drew that. But the impact of the asset renewals takes longer to come into effect in terms of the asset availability for those types of assets.
And this is just the traffic lights and signals on TfL roads. This has nothing to do with the borough-wide network.
Well, the TfL owns and controls and maintains all of London's traffic signals.
Oh, okay.
But the street lighting will be just those on the TfL road network.
Street lights on TfL road, but the traffic signals, that's across London.
That's correct.
That's lovely. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so maybe Deval wants to come in on this question and then we'll move on to yours straight
Okay, just going on. So, can I, so I'm looking at your 2018 business plan. So a 5-year projection, you're almost saying that we need to be spending something like 150 to 145 in terms of your projections around this. So look, my first question, because I think we need to establish this. If we continue on along these lines, it will be bad news for TfL roads, right? If we continue to have a holding pattern of not meeting, future needs or changes. But can we just put that on record? Because I just want to be clear. So should I start worrying over the next 5 years if I don't start seeing this budget creep back up to a certain level, which I presumed in the business plan is based on the renewals that we need to do on the TfL roads. So remember, you've only got 5% of the roads, but you carry 30% of the traffic. So am I right in thinking that the figures that you've based in your business plan to bring these figures back up, to start spending again in this area, is based on a technical assessment, you have to do this work? And should I be worried if you don't hit these figures in future business plans?
I think the answer yes to your questions. So certainly if we maintained a reactive strategy for the long term, that would be a bad outcome. That's a bad asset management approach. And if you did a purely reactive strategy for the long term, it would be about 30% more expensive than a really balanced approach of doing the right mix of reactive and proactive approaches. As I said, given it's a 2-year pause, I think it's got much more of a minimal impact. We think it's probably got a 1% cost increase, but it's a very steep curve. If you don't restart that proactive renewals and the backlog builds up, that does lead you into a bad situation that we've seen some other cities get themselves into. But our business plan does take that into account, and the profile over the next few years restores our proactive renewals and starts to address that backlog such that we would get back to our targets for state of good repair.
I'm trying to think of some of the renewals that have taken place in my constituency that were done at the front end, so it's coming up to that renewal period of those. So I'm right in thinking for all those, for the next 4 years, you could share a programme of what you think, as of to date, what needs to happen in those periods of time, the profile of which bits of TfL roads will need to be renewed and which won't. Now, of course, there may well be some emergency issues and there may well be some flex in that, but by and large, someone would have done that against the budget projections you're doing of saying X road needs to definitely be looked at, we should be planning for that, that's why it's in the budget, with some contingency. Because I think this is quite useful for us to keep a hold on and look at over the coming years, but also to share with our Transport Committee of what those plans are. So can we see that list of what your technical officers are advising you to do over that period that meets why there is a rise in budget so in subsequent years? Because I think it looks like that's where it is. So that must be against need or someone's assessment of need, and we need to look at that.
So we have a very detailed schedule for the year ahead. So the next 12 months, kind of individual...
I'm looking beyond that.
Yeah, but I'll come to that. But very, very detailed long list, asset by asset, what we plan to do in the next 12 months. And you're absolutely right. That doesn't account for the whole budget, because we leave an element for reactive works that comes up for the year that we can't foresee. Over the 5-year business plan period, we have that, but at a slightly higher level. So for our major structures, they're sequenced over a 5, if not a 10-year plan where we think we're going to come to do them. Now, clearly, we'd only renew an asset if it was the right thing to do. So there'll be an inspection and a continued monitoring, and we flex our plans based on the individual asset condition. But we do have that for our major structures. And for all our other structures, such as carriageways, we'll have modelling of those assets that describe why we think that's the appropriate amount, given where the asset listing currently is and our projections for where it would go without action.
The trouble is, I think we're all in agreement on, and we all come from local government, we know that these cuts or this delay in terms of these renewals leads to more money either being spent or is a false economy. What we don't want TfL is to slip into bad habits of our colleagues in local government who quite frankly have got no flexibility and no choice in terms of their resurfacing programmes around some of those issues. But in terms of the delay that you've talked about is 2 years, we can't, TfL, from where I'm thinking in terms of the usage of our roads, which is probably a lot heavier than normal council roads, can't tolerate a further holding period. It looks like a soft option. It always does within these technical budgets. The degree of sophistication in TfL, do your colleagues realise that it's not a soft option, that over a period of time that this could actually be quite a much more serious issue in terms of delayed expenditure maintaining the quality of that road infrastructure?
Yes, I think across the organisation we recognise the importance of asset renewals, and we have got very good understanding of our asset condition. That's widely shared and understood across the organisation. When Mike, Ryan and Simon were here talking about our budget principles, they would have talked about the importance of our critical category in terms of how we're prioritising our assets, included our renewals. So there's definitely an emphasis behind that, recognising the importance that it has and the fact that longer than a 2-year asset pause would start to have some more significant consequences the longer that went on.
Okay, so let's now turn to my core questions really, which is more about the impact on users and issues around that. And just in terms of setting the scene again, can you just, so in terms of cleaning roads, TfL roads, that budget has not been affected. That you've not, so forgive me, So in terms of my experience of managing budgets and looking at where it is, there's no some secretive directive saying don't spend the full amount on this and see where you can save, and you're skimming it off on the revenue budgets, because some of these are contracts, aren't they? So in terms of, does that come under, that doesn't fit into the road renewals. My cleaning of a TfL road is particularly unaffected because the budgets look like virtually saying the same. So if I have a problem, it's because it's not being managed properly. It's not being managed properly or implemented properly. Is that the case?
So you're
I'm
correct.
thinking of debris on the roads and some of the issues in my casework that I usually get from cyclists who complain about certain roads of why it's not working out and all the rest of it. I don't blame it on cuts. I usually claim it and say, well, why aren't we doing this?
So you're correct that those types of activities will be funded from our maintenance budgets.
Yeah.
Of that type of activity, such as cleaning, our contractors work on a lump sum basis that we give them a fixed amount of money to manage those types of issues to a set of agreed standards. And you're right, our job is to make sure that they do meet those standards and penalise them where they don't.
There's been no changes in any of the specs in recent contracts about this work.
So we've not changed the specs of any of our core maintenance or cleaning or work like that. We have been working with our supply chain to deliver savings, as we have done across the whole organisation. And as a result of the reduced pipeline of activities, actually one of our contractors exited London, and we've restructured it such that we have 3 main contractors rather than 4. We have looked at some of the service standards that may have been overstated in a time where TfL wasn't not as financially constrained, and really challenge ourselves where we're delivering value for money, but we've not cut back on any of the core services such as cleaning in our contracts.
And have we got in the psyche of our technical officers who inspect these roads? They're not just expecting them to the road surface for the car user, but they're also checking it for carriageway, the pedestrians, but also for cyclists and motorcyclists in the sense of that, in terms of any lanes they're using. Is that embedded in TfL's road user issues, that they are looking out for other people other than cars and lorries in that sense? I'm not saying they're unimportant, I'm saying there are other users that your technical officers, when they're looking and inspecting roads, that they're taking that into account.
Absolutely. And I think actually with a limited budget that we have for reactive renewals and emergency works, we've really focused on any types of issues that would impact cyclists, pedestrians or public transport users, and with our limited budget we prioritise those rather than necessarily those that would only impact private car users. And I think also we spent some time with our highways authorities both across London and across the country, and actually I truly believe that our asset engineers and inspectors have the best holistic view of the road network. Actually, we don't just have data on carriageways, we have it on footways, verges, embankments, central reservations, lighting. We have a really rounded view of the road assets. That gives us a really good basis to make sure all road users are being protected, not just those in private cars.
Andrew, let's come to you in terms of this, because I think this is, I've had my post, I wouldn't say it's massive numbers, but where they have raised issues, they have been of real concern about road users on this issue. So somehow set the scene of what you think the picture is. And of course, we're looking at TfL today. I was very upset that London councils weren't here, because I think they've got a part to play as well. In terms of the road network and those users. So set the scene for us about, from your perspective as a road user and your expertise from a cycling, but comment on other issues.
My key concern, as I said to Jeanette, is the enormous rise in the number of casualties, KSIs. And it can't be wished away as the figures being provisional. I mean, the figures might be adjusted slightly, but they're not going to change all that much. So if it turns out to be a 90% rise or a 75% rise, it's still enormous. And I think obviously some of it's due to a rise in traffic generally, but I think a good deal of it is due to the way that the administration's handled the roads programme. Meaningful improvements to the road of almost any kind, of almost ground to a halt really, outside 3 mini Holland boroughs. We have 10 worthwhile schemes now put forward by TfL in limbo, consulted on with big majorities for action between 1 and 4 years ago, but where work still hasn't started. And 9 of those 10 were left by us. It looks like they're finally getting started on 1 or 2, 3 years later, but most of the schemes we left them are either cancelled or still in limbo. Quite a lot of the new schemes proposed since May 2016, with one exception, I think CS9 are mediocre or worse. They don't deliver real improvements, and that's actually perhaps my key concern from a kind of budget point of view. It's not just a question of lack of money, as TfL says, or actually even of the balance in the budget between roads and public transport. Even within the reduced roads budget, very large sums are being wasted on road schemes that deliver little or no meaningful change. And I think particularly of the quiet ways, where at least there's a sort of cycling back streets route programme, at least £46 million has been spent on that programme, according to answers to the Assembly, since May 2016, with almost literally nothing meaningful to show for it. The broader Healthy Streets programme, of which the quiet ways are a part, that is budgeted to cost £177 million in the 2019-20 budget. But again, from the schemes badged under it proposed so far, it is also of highly variable quality. The Mini Holland schemes, I think, and one of the TfL schemes, CS9, are good. That's the good part of Healthy Streets. But I think on many other schemes, Healthy Streets is risking wasting very large amounts of money on mediocre or cosmetic schemes. We've seen schemes such as at Camberwell Green, for instance, badged as Healthy Street schemes. It's a prime example of a scheme that amounts to very little more than the status quo with nicer paving slabs. And that is what Healthy Streets often seems to mean. And that's a huge waste. It's a huge waste of money that's very tight. I think there's a culture of virtue signalling, of PR announcements, and gesture politics rather than actual action. And sometimes actually that PR strategy shades into direct and provable lies. There is a claim, the Mayor has repeatedly claimed to have built 140 kilometres of new cycle routes since 2016. He was asked by an Assembly member, Caroline Pigeon, to list where those routes were, provided a whole list of routes supposedly built under him, and having ridden many of those new routes, I can say that literally nothing has been done on very many of them, and in other cases it's just re-signposting of existing cycle routes which have been there for years. So I think that's probably my core concern. I accept that TfL's been placed in a difficult situation by the reduction in government grant, but as you said, Gareth, there's also choices to be made about how that's allocated. At the moment, I think they're hoping to keep the surface budget to, I think it was 850 million, of which about 720 million is going on the buses. But there is also concern about how they are spending the remaining 130 million, and I don't think they're spending it in ways which delivers value for money.
Now so there's a lot in there, and we shouldn't lose that, because some of our transport colleagues will want to follow up on the general policies and some of the schemes that you highlight. But if I'm taking it back in terms of some of the issues around safety, is the slowness on the resurfacing budget likely to affect, how does some of the changes which are identified to make, let's say, cycling more safer would come in on the back of that? So if I look at the programme for in future years where it's going back up, a TfL should be able to provide me where it's going to make a difference to all road users, including safety of cyclists. Is that, am I right in thinking of that in terms of your expertise when you were in TfL and all those issues? So we may wish to adjust the list of information we want to ask later on, because I'm quite interested to see where the future programme is going once the money starts to go up. Do you know what I mean?
I think a number of schemes have been proposed at locations where there is a significant danger to cyclists and pedestrians, and actually to all road users, to drivers as well, actually, because they're badly designed. We are now told that work will finally start on Old Street this year, the Old Street roundabout, where several people had been killed or seriously injured on bikes and pedestrians. But that scheme was consulted on in 2015. The consultation finished more than 4 years ago, and nothing's happened. And okay, I'm glad it's finally going to start, but it's a symptom of the general lack of energy and purpose in the roads improvement programme. There's a whole series of others where schemes put forward either by us or by this mayor have been consulted on more than a year ago in every case, but where nothing has started. So CS9 was consulted on in September and October 2017, more than a year ago. We now see from today's budget that they're not even going to finalise the detailed designs for part of the route until December of this year. So God knows when they're going to start building it. We see a whole series of schemes. We see a protected route out to West London was cancelled. We see CS11 up to Swiss Cottage, and the Swiss Cottage gyratory scheme was allowed to drift for years, and that gave Westminster Council the opportunity to come in with a judicial review to halt it. That now seems to have been completely killed. We see schemes. We see one or two schemes partially completed, and we see a lot of schemes just hanging around in limbo with nothing really happening on them.
You rightly, I think, challenge me, not because look, casualties on roads are very serious. The question is the causes of that. You rightly raised the figure work and said, look, it's got to be higher than more than just collisions. You've heard the TfL officer, and we come back to Patrick as well, saying what he thought the percentage was. Of course, that's one too many. But in terms of the issues about road servicing, obstacles, clutter, debris in the roads, why do you think, look, where's the evidence, if I can ask, where do you think that is? Is that because you're talking to the networks and this is what's coming back from the people that you're talking to and you think that's it? Is our recording going amiss? Are we not picking up some of those issues? Why do you think it's slightly higher?
Well, I think we know what the problem is.
Yeah.
And my principal evidence is those casualty figures I gave you.
Right.
There's been a huge rise. The casualty figures I gave you for everyone, pedestrians, cyclists, all road users. But there has been a huge rise in KSIs, serious injuries, particularly for cyclists. I don't have access to internal TfL figures on how many claims over potholes there have been. But clearly, empirically, we can see I can see from my daily commutes that the surfaces of the road are not what they should be. They have the surface of the TfL-owned stretch of Jamaica Road is pretty poor, as is the borough-owned bit on Lower Road, and I can see how dangerous it is as well, because if you're cycling along and you hit, you can usually stay around them, but if you're cycling on and you don't see it, if it's dark or something, or it's raining, or there's a puddle covering it, you hit one of these potholes, you go off, you're under a bus. And that has to have, the deteriorating quality of the roads, which I've empirically observed, has to have something to do with the rise in casualties that there has been. As I say, I don't think it's the whole explanation. There's been a rise in traffic as well, but I think it is an important part of the explanation.
Okay. In terms of just going, just pursuing, so let's do that. So, Patrick, you've heard some of those issues. Road safety is a factor in some issues. I think road safety plus debris could be a factor. What do you say to that? You quoted some figures to us. What's your evidence in terms of justifying what you told this committee?
As I say, I think our core evidence is the validated numbers of those that are killed and seriously injured on London's roads, which isn't showing the increase that Andrew's referred to.
What is it showing?
I believe it's broadly flat, but I think we can.
That accounts for an 83% difference.
I think rather than debating it now, I think it would be much easier for my colleagues to provide that to the committee and yourself, if you so wish, after the meeting. And I think we'll be publishing that in our TfL board papers.
Can I go back to the last validated quarter-on-quarter comparison, which is quarter 4 of 2017? There were 1,008 deaths and serious injuries on the roads in that quarter, compared with the previous quarter of the previous year, there were 848. So that seems to me to be an increase of about 25%. Am I right about that?
I
figures.
think the other thing that you might be missing, unfortunately, is that in 2017 the Met Police introduced a new reporting system where they're reporting things on a handheld device in real time. And actually, you want to do a like-for-like comparison with 2017 and 2016.
Okay. Well, let me do that. Quarter 2 2017, 1,010 deaths and serious injuries on the road. Quarter 2 2016, 541. That's actually worse than 83%. That's almost double, and that's on the same like-for-like comparison.
I mean, Chair, I would welcome you sharing Andrew to comment on some of those issues and get down to the grain of this. I'm interested to see what's road surface responsibility, what isn't, and trying to get back onto that, and whether we are on top of this as an organisation in terms of TfL around that particular issue, because that's something we can do something about. We can't do something about some of these other collisions, except where to make things more safely in terms of improvement in the road layout and in terms of some of the work that was done on junctions and earlier on, which we could do. Those two areas, it seems to me. But if we could do that real time and as quickly as possible, because again, that might well be something we would wish to follow up or comment on and share that for comments in terms of
I think, if I can help, what we'll do at the end of the meeting is we'll write to both of you in the normal way. And any information that you care to share, then that will be good, but we are particularly interested in these figures. I mean, I agree with Patrick that we need to compare apples and apples, not apples and oranges. But similarly, I've got some sympathy with Andrew's argument that I doubt that there's going to be such a massive variance. I mean, in the first instance, we heard that it was unvalidated, then we heard that it was going to be flat, and then we heard that it was because there was a new reporting mechanism. These sound like excuses, and I'm not saying they are, but I think once we get to the data beneath it and do compare like for like, then we'll have a much clearer picture.
As I say, even the comparison of like-for-like data that I just gave you shows a dramatic increase. I mean, I think it'd be very interesting to know how it will change when they're validated.
But yeah, I think that's critical. Make sure that we're clear on the data, as I said. But coming back to the topic of the day about road maintenance, the key indicator we use that is whether that's been a root cause in any of those killed and seriously injured incidents. Because what we want to do is understand the root cause of all the injuries and fatalities on the network and make sure that we're addressing them. But our data shows us that road surface conditions are a very small proportion of contributing factors.
And I think that distinction between road maintenance and road surfacing, and the surfaces, we want to drill down to. Because if the budget hasn't changed on road maintenance, and there is still an issue around where that accidents or death has been caused by that, then I want to go back to start asking about the inspection regime of when and how, because that's money that can't be blamed on cuts. That's about the use of existing money and the quality of the service we're providing. And then on the road surfacing issue, it would be quite interesting, and some of the other information it would be quite useful to have about when does road deterioration start? Now we know that potholes, and my limited experience of this, I am a non-driver, but in terms of my limited experience is that you see holes occurring in roads where there is weather fracturing, water penetration and everything else. I'd be quite interested to see whether there is a deterioration of roads at the edges, because that's where we put cyclists and other issues on the edges, and whether we are up to, when we're doing inspections, whether we just do that or not. Is there other regimes that come into place? So I mean, I'd welcome some detail about that as Sheriff at the end, if we could do, when we pick those issues up.
I think the other thing to add is we had a relatively mild winter this year, and that means the roads are probably in a better state than they would otherwise have been. So the position might actually in future winters be even worse.
Very much so, with the conditions.
That's certainly true at the moment. But yes, we can certainly describe our visual inspections. As I said, that is people going out on site, understanding the condition of the assets, and in particular, if there are defects, where they are in the carriageway, whether it's close to where cyclists would go, whether it's in the middle of the carriageway. That's part of the risk assessment they're making when they recommend the action that they take should be taken as a result of their inspections.
Okay. Right, we're nearly there. Just a few tidying up questions, really. suppose this is a how long is a piece of string question, but what is the optimum level of road expenditure?
So for the TfL road network, if I start off there, we think the optimum level would be around about 120 to 130 million pounds per annum. We think if we were in a steady state situation, that would maintain us in our target states of good repair for our key asset ranges. And that's about the amount we spent in 2016-17. But this year we are spending 31 million. So we're clearly spending below, because we paused that proactive asset renewals, we're now spending below that optimum range. That's why we see the state of good repair drop slightly and drop narrowly outside of our target range. And to get it back, we'll have to address that backlog and work it back through to our target. If you look at London overall, because I said this is a London issue, we've been working with the London boroughs and London councils and their technical advisors group to produce a state of the city report. And that looks in a slightly different way, but that analysis shows that we're probably about £60 million a year short on the level of total maintenance renewals that all of London's roads needs to keep them in a good condition, and that means that overall backlog for London is building up.
Do you have a view, Andrew?
My concern is that even in a time of straitened resources, which I accept we are, we're not spending the budget properly, and I do think there needs to be, quite stringent monitoring of how the roads budget is being spent. A lot of it's being wasted on schemes which aren't of any value at the moment, and that needs to change. If TfL wanted to, it probably does have enough money to do meaningful things that would help cyclists and maintain the roads properly. It's just decided to waste the money on other things instead.
Foot walkers.
Yes, absolutely.
More people walk
absolutely
still
right.
than are on bikes, Andrew.
That's absolutely right. And these schemes, my problem with the Healthy Streets schemes is that they don't really do much for walkers either.
No.
And generally what's good for cyclists is good for walkers, but not always, but generally. And these schemes are really, it's very difficult to know exactly what this enormous sum of money on the quiet list has actually bought. Well, it's bought a few symbols painted on the roads, it's bought a few new crossings, hasn't bought a single meaningful new route that didn't already exist, and that really is a scandal.
Patrick, the asset capital programme for 17-18, which appeared in the TfL programme, so we fixed it up from March 2017, shows the risk distribution. Shows that planned spend on the decision before the decision to pause was mostly on assets with a high risk rating, particularly carriageways, structures, traffic signals, etc. Now that there's less money going in, has that had an impact on the risk distribution? Has it pushed it higher?
Well, when we consider risk, we consider different dimensions. So safety risk, operability risk, and reliability risk. And I think we've been really focused on managing that safety risk down. So actually, as I talked about, our robust practices, the inspections, the testing and the defect repairs, in some cases we've increased to manage down any safety risk and keep it to the same level. And that's also reflected the fact that where necessary, we'll put in place limits and restrictions, such as those I mentioned on Rotherhithe Tunnel, that maintain safety. But actually, they do have an impact on operability and reliability, because commercial vans and lorries can't use the Rotherhithe Tunnel. So actually, in terms of risk, the overall risk profile has increased in terms of reliability and operability of those assets. But actually, we have focused on safety, and that element, we believe, has not increased.
Okay. But the quid pro quo is that it's increased congestion and had a knock-on effect on the economy, presumably.
We think it's had a limited impact on congestion. We think actually that 75% of congestion is caused by the fact there's too much demand for a finite space. So the impact that any asset closures or restrictions that we've had done so far would be very, very marginal in terms of the overall congestion that London faces.
The failure to do any schemes that address, congestion is part of the reason why congestion is growing. One of the motivations behind the cycling programme that we had was to make better use of what was always going to be limited road space, allowing it to move more people. And the failure to continue with that has meant that traffic has continued to grow more than it otherwise might, and has contributed to congestion. A whole load of other policy decisions as well, of course. The decision, for instance, to I think we were proposing applying a congestion charge to private hire vehicles. That was dropped initially by Sadiq. He's now picked it up again, but that was a 2-year delay to that proposal. So it's that kind of thing.
Well, though, in fairness to the Mayor, the TfL's own modelling on that indicates only a 1% reduction in congestion by introducing that.
That's true. Yeah, well, that's. I mean, there's a need for bigger and bolder thinking about how we deal with the growth of motor traffic in London, but we're not getting it. And I think I personally have always supported a significant rise in the congestion charge, but of course it's fallen in real terms.
Short shrift there then for that comment from the chair.
I've made no comment at all. I don't drive into London, it wouldn't affect me.
Well, a cyclist would say that, wouldn't they?
Well, look, in all seriousness though, I mean, I suppose the final question, we've talked about funding for TfL, particularly for the roads programme, and you, Patrick, and TfL collectively have made the case that there needs to be a better way of funding roads. And the obvious one, and the ask that was made by London Finance Commission 1 and 2, and has had unanimous support in the Assembly, as I said earlier on, is the devolution of vehicle excise duty. The government haven't shown a huge amount of willingness, it's fair to say, to entertain that idea. In the event that that does not happen, what would be the best realistic alternatives in both of your views?
I think the best realistic alternative would be to look at how the Major Road Network Fund is being used. It's actually the Department for Transport has recognised that there are roads in the country other than Highways England's roads that are important, and they've top sliced some of that vehicle excise duty to fund a major road network, which is a really positive step. Unfortunately, there have been some flaws to how that's been executed that we don't think it gives the right answer. So first, there's a definitional challenge that they've excluded all roads within the North and South Circular for a reason that we don't understand. So the approach road to the Blackwall Tunnel is not designated as a major road, despite its importance to the region, if not the national road network. But more crucially, it's a bidding scheme that actually we are being invited to submit bids, and clearly we are grateful for any money that we've received, and we're happy to work with the Transport Department on Gallows Corner, which is a bid that they've favoured. But actually, a bidding scheme doesn't address the underlying issue that we've got in terms of certainty and cost effectiveness. But actually, where we are bidding, Transport for London and the boroughs and all the other highways agencies across the country are investing costs into the bids, only which a small proportion of which will come off. So actually introduces additional cost into the system at a time where budgets are limited. And it doesn't provide the certainty, because actually the funding's only coming if you succeed in winning those bids for a one-off improvement scheme. I think actually to address the core challenges that not only London but all the cities across the country face, I think there's a better way to use that money in a needs-based way, provide steady and sustained funding across the country rather than to specific one-off improvements.
I think the Mayor's chances of getting anything significant from government, any sort of further grant, have been undermined by his kind of constant posturing on issues against the government. And I know it's fun to attack Chris Grayling. We've all done it. He's a natural target, but actually he's the guy who holds the purse strings, and it's very silly to have these kind of rows with him that Sadiq's been having. So I can see they're taking pleasure in not giving Sadiq any more money and denying him things which other mayors, including Labour mayors, are getting. But that's just the politics of it. That's just how Sadiq has misplayed his hand. So I think the only main chance is to find ways you can raise money yourself using revenue raising powers you already have. And I actually think there should, as I said, I think the congestion charge offers an opportunity to raise quite significant amounts of money if you want to, extending its hours of operation. Actually, the most congested hour of the day now is outside the hours when the charge is operating. It's the hours after it finishes, and also between 11 and 12 at the weekends as well, which is bizarre. And that's a factor of the minicabs. And looking at other revenue raising opportunities as well. and that could go. Well, I mean, one thing that could go hand in hand with a genuinely Vision Zero approach to reducing road casualties, which we're obviously seeing reverse at the moment, is much stricter enforcement of existing traffic laws. So recruit more people to enforce laws about parking and stopping and ban turns and going in bus lanes and breaking the congestion charge, and raise the fines that you levy on those people, and that's and that wouldn't just improve congestion. It wouldn't just improve general behaviour and civility and law and order in the city generally. It would probably raise some money too. But I to be honest, I'm not sure I can imagine him doing either of those things. But that's what I'd do.
Okay. Right, chaps. Can I thank you both very much for attendance? We've reached the end of the Q&A session. If you wouldn't mind staying put just for a few more minutes, and we'll be done. Members, can we note the report and the contents of today's discussion?
Yeah.
Item 6 is the GLA Group monitoring reports for quarter 3, 18-19. Can we note those? Item 7 is the Mayor's decision list for the 9th of November 2018 to the 11th of February 2019. Can we note those? Are there any issues that we want to refer to the Budget and Performance Committee for detailed consideration?
Can we do that offline, depending on what information comes back?
Yeah, we can talk about that separately. Okay, item 8 is payments over £250. Can we note the report detailing the payments over £250 in quarter 3?
Yeah.
Item 9 is the work programme for the remainder of the year. Can we note the provisional scheduled meetings? This is for next year, and it's dependent on the AGM.
Yeah.
Thank you. The date of the next meeting is the AGM of the Assembly, which is on the 12th of June. Sorry, the next meeting of the subcommittee is scheduled for the 12th of June 2019 at 2 o'clock in this room. Yeah. Item 11, any other business that I consider to be urgent? There is one item which I have decided to include, and it's to take advantage of your presence, Patrick, which is the reports, I saw it in The Guardian, and I think it's in other places as well, of an understanding that's been arranged between Transport for London and Tottenham Hotspur regarding the renaming of White Hart Lane Station. Has there been a memorandum or agreement been entered into with Tottenham Hotspur?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this, because I think the Guardian article is based on some partial and in some places inaccurate information. So we are pursuing a long-term brand partnership with Tottenham, which would include the renaming of the station. Those discussions are ongoing and have not yet concluded, but that is something that we're seeking to work with, and we'll be able to announce more details on that shortly.
Okay. The article implied that there would be no cost to Tottenham Hotspur if that happened. Is that accurate?
So that's one of the things I'd like to correct, that actually the partnership that we're looking to seek would come with a cash element contribution and a value in kind element contribution from Tottenham Hotspur to TfL. And we're looking at two factors. We've got an independent valuation of the value of the naming rights for the station, and we're getting an independent valuation on the deal that we're proposing to value both the cash and the value in kind elements. And we're confident that the value that we're getting will exceed the commercial value of the naming rights of the station.
To be clear, the independent valuation estimated that it was £11.7 million over 10 years and £3 million to implement. Does that sound familiar?
I've not provided all the numbers. I know we've been working at reducing the costs, both with ourselves and Network Rail, because that's where the costs come in terms of the technical factors that are required to enable a station renaming, and we've been working on reducing that. But we're confident that the value we're going to secure for the deal will exceed the commercial value of the naming rights.
So more than £11.7 million?
More than the final valuation, including our latest year of the costs, having worked to reduce them.
And that value will be the cash value plus the benefit in kind?
So it's a combined deal of cash and value in kind, yes.
And combined it will be more than the number that's been quoted in the press?
It will be more than the commercial value of the naming rights.
Okay. So there won't be a nil payment from Tottenham Hotspur to Transport for London?
No, absolutely not. We're getting value out of this, both in a cash element of contribution and a value in kind element of contribution. And crucially, it's broader than just naming rights. We're looking into a long-term brand partnership We think that can enable further cost savings in TfL, help generate revenue streams for TfL, and we're looking to have a broader positive impact in the local community. So we think there are much broader benefits here, but we have been rigorous in terms of the commercial value that we're extracting.
When do you expect to conclude the negotiations on that? When will this be in the public domain?
So Graham Craig, our Director of Commercial Development, is leading on this. He said that we hope to conclude them shortly. And he's also offered to give a briefing in any form that you think is best suitable to committee members if you'd like to explore this in more detail.
I think we'll be happy to do that. I think we'll write to Graham directly on that, and it looks like you are. Senator Arnold.
I mean, thank you for that clarification, because you can appreciate that given our circumstances, given the situation TfL's in, that any idea of transferring TfL assets to even the glorious Tottenham Hotspur private company would absolutely be something that Londoners would be against.
Absolutely, and we stand by the fact that we're going to secure a deal that's commercially acceptable for London and for TfL.
And the business of this committee is now, year on year, we pick up the upsies in these deals, if I can call them upsies in these deals. I mean, our papers are littered with them. Some of them from you, some of them from TfL. So can we be assured, A, that lessons have been learned in terms of how parts of the GLA group and TfL have dealt with the private sector on these issues, and that things like the cost of the rebranding and all the costs associated will be part and part of the package, so that we don't then pick up in a later committee paper that, oh dear, we missed out something, that means that the London, Londoners will have to put more money into this scheme.
Well, certainly that's why we brought in independent valuations, both of the commercial naming rights, to make sure it's not just our estimate, but it's an independent value of the naming rights, and a separate independent value of the deal that we're striking. So again, we're getting that independent assurance. This is a good commercial deal for London and TfL.
And are these the people that worked with you that allowed you to get a substantial money, like over 100,000 for 2 days branding of Canada Water?
I don't know the details of the advisors' work either on that case or this particular case, but I'm sure Graham would be happy to talk through those
We'll pick up
details.
with Graham.
Okay.
Okay, thank you all very much. There's no further business, so the meeting is closed.
Thank you.
Yes.
How's it going?